In a world broken by injustice, one man rose not with violence, but with a voice that echoed louder than bullets. A boy born under the weight of racial chains became a global symbol of dignity, sacrifice, and unstoppable will. His name was Nelson Mandela, and his journey from a quiet village in South Africa to the highest office of his nation is not just history, it's a heartbeat. A story of pain, prison, and perseverance. Of dreams deferred but never destroyed. This is not just a man's story, it's the fight of a soul that refused to surrender. If you're someone who feels a chill down your spine when history whispers its forgotten tales, if you find beauty in broken crowns, lost empires, and powerful souls who change the world, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Dark Historian Tales, the channel where we bring the shadows of the past into the light, through emotional storytelling, raw truths, and dramatic journeys that shaped humanity. This isn't just history, it's the heartbeat of those who lived, loved, lost, and left a legacy. Backhand index pointing, right? So if you love powerful historical stories, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. Because here, history doesn't just speak, it haunts. In the dusty hills of Mvizo, a small village nestled along the banks of the Mbash River in South Africa's Eastern Cape, a child came into the world who would one day come to represent freedom itself. Born on July 18, 1918, to a lineage deeply rooted in tribal nobility and African heritage, Nelson Mandela was no ordinary infant. His Xhosa name, Relila, loosely translated to pulling the branch of a tree, a phrase that in time would seem prophetic, as this child would grow into a man who shook the deeply rooted tree of oppression that had long stood unchallenged. His journey, however, began far from speeches and struggles, in the soft arms of his mother, in the silence of a colonized land that had forgotten the value of black voices. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniiswa, was a respected chief and counselor to the Thembu royal family, a man of fierce pride and quiet resistance who refused to bow to the authority of white magistrates. That pride would cost him his position, forcing the family to leave Mvizo for the village of Kunu. Yet, even in exile, his father's dignity left an impression on young Relila that time could not erode. It was here, among the cattle, barefoot races, and boyish battles of rural life, that Mandela's earliest sense of justice and fairness began to take shape. Not from law books or political doctrine, but from the innate human instinct to stand upright, to be seen, and to be heard. Mandela remembered his mother, Nosekini, with reverence, a devout Christian woman who wrapped her son in love and prayer. She would walk miles to the Methodist church every Sunday, her quiet devotion painting the earliest pictures of discipline and endurance in her son's mind. When Relila was just 9, a quiet sorrow spread through the village like a shadow. His father died of lung disease. Though the boy was too young to grasp the full gravity of the loss, something inside him shifted. The man who had stood against colonial authority with unbending dignity was gone, and in his absence, a new door opened. His mother, knowing her late husband's wishes, took her son to the palace of Chief Jonjantaba Dalandibo in Kekazwini, a powerful figure in Thembuland and a guardian appointed to raise Mandela as his ward. The young boy, now living in the royal court, was suddenly surrounded by protocol, power, and the early echoes of leadership. Mandela had entered a world where stories were not just told but lived. Stories of wars, treaties, and betrayals passed down through oral tradition, etched into the hearts of the elders. At night, seated around the fire, young Relila listened with wide eyes as the old men spoke of a time before white men arrived, before chains and categories and color codes separated human from human. In Kekeswini, Mandela's mind opened like a window to a world that lay beyond the hills of his childhood. He absorbed the customs of his people, the importance of Ubuntu, a philosophy that defined humanity as a shared experience, and the delicate dance between tradition and transformation. His formal education began at a small missionary school, where, in typical colonial fashion, his teacher refused to pronounce his African name. Instead, she called him Nelson, a name that would someday echo through the chambers of the United Nations, across prisons and parliaments, but that began with a quiet erasure of identity, a symbol of the empire's authority over the African child's future. Mandela was bright, curious, and respectful, but never docile. Even as a teenager, there were glimpses of the man he would become. When he played stick fights with friends, he didn't just aim to win. He aimed to understand. He listened. He calculated. He refused to strike unfairly or abuse his strength, but he also didn't back down when his dignity was on the line. "A man must stand," his father had once said. And in every aspect of life, Mandela tried to do just that, to stand. For himself. For others. For what was right. The concrete streets of Johannesburg felt nothing like the red earth of Kunu. Gone were the gentle hills and the quiet hum of rural life. Now there were buildings made of stone and glass, narrow alleys soaked in tension, and a city breathing with inequality. When Nelson Mandela stepped onto this unfamiliar soil, he was not yet a symbol, not yet a rebel. He was just a young man with curiosity in his heart and questions burning in his soul. But the city would change him. At first, he arrived timidly, cautious of the city's fast rhythm. His eyes scanned the faces of white men who walked with unshakable confidence and black men who bent under invisible weights. The contrast was unbearable. Here, in the so-called economic heart of South Africa, the air crackled with injustice. And yet, nobody screamed. Nobody fought. The oppression was so deeply embedded, it had been mistaken for normal. Mandela had come to Johannesburg fleeing a life that had already been mapped out for him. He had fled an arranged marriage, tradition, and the suffocating weight of obedience. He did not yet know where he was running, only what he was running from. But the city had a way of finding a man's truth. And soon it would show Mandela his. Living in Alexandra, a crowded, chaotic black township where the dust never settled, he experienced the daily hunger, the exploitation, and the disrespect that black South Africans endured. He walked miles to work. He was underpaid, overworked, and always watched. And the questions returned each night like ghosts. Why? Why were some men born to own, and others born to obey? It was during this time he met Walter Sisulu, a man who would become more than a friend. Sisulu saw something in Mandela, something restless, sharp, and unbreakable. He brought him into his home, offered him a job at a law firm, and introduced him to the African National Congress, ANC. This was not just a social favor. This was the beginning of a revolution. Mandela's first steps into the world of law were humble. He wore suits that didn't quite fit and carried books that felt heavier than his own confidence. But with each case he read, each client he met, and each injustice he witnessed, a fire began to glow inside him. Law wasn't just a career, it was a weapon. A way to push back without picking up a stone. A way to defend the dignity of a people long robbed of it. But law, he realized, had its limits. Courts were ruled by white judges. Laws were written to keep the system alive. And while the legal path gave him purpose, it couldn't heal his fury. Because outside the courtroom, young black boys were being beaten for walking on the wrong side of a street. Women were harassed for not carrying their passbooks. Fathers disappeared for speaking out. And all the while, the government's iron grip tightened. Mandela joined the ANC officially, not just as a member, but as a man ready to fight. At first, he believed in peaceful resistance. Inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, who had also lived in South Africa and who had also been humiliated by the system, Mandela believed that dignity could defeat hatred. That marches, petitions, and speeches could topple giants. He stood before crowds, his voice trembling, but his words sharp. He told them their suffering was not natural. He told them their silence was not peace. He told them they had been taught to crawl, but they were born to stand. The people listened. Some nodded. Some cried. Some whispered, "This one, he is different." But the government did not listen. They arrested protesters. They banned meetings. They passed new laws to tighten the chains. And Mandela began to understand. Even dreams had limits under a government built on fear. One night, after a brutal police raid that left bodies broken and spirits crushed, Mandela sat alone in a small room. His fingers ran over the creases of a pamphlet calling for justice. He stared at a photo of a boy who had been killed for asking for his father's release. That boy's eyes haunted him, and for the first time, Mandela asked himself, was peace still enough? The ANC Youth League was not born in silence. It was born in frustration, in the heartbeats of young men who had seen too much and endured too long. And Nelson Mandela, once a cautious observer of history, now stood among them as a maker of it. Together with Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Anton Lembede, and others, he helped give birth to a new generation of freedom fighters, ones who no longer bowed before the system but challenged it, brick by brick. The League believed that the time for waiting was over. The older generation had petitioned, had written letters to oppressors who burned them unread, had prayed for justice in a land where God was often used as a tool for tyranny. Mandela and his comrades chose another path, one of mass mobilization, of boycotts, of strikes, of refusal. It was in this fire that Mandela's voice changed. No longer trembling, it roared. When he spoke at rallies, the people did not simply listen, they felt. Every sentence was a hammer, every word a blow to the towering wall of apartheid. He didn't just talk about freedom, he made his people taste it in the air, even for just a moment. But power listens when it feels threatened. In 1952, Mandela and other leaders launched the Defiance Campaign, a large-scale nonviolent protest against apartheid laws. Volunteers across the country deliberately violated oppressive regulations, entering whites-only areas, refusing to carry passbooks, sitting on forbidden benches. They were arrested by the thousands, and Mandela was among them. He stood before the court not as a criminal, but as a mirror held to the face of a brutal regime. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Mandela replied not with apology, but with purpose. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. The courtroom was silent. Even the white reporters looked up from their notebooks. The rebel had found his voice, and South Africa had found its conscience. He was sentenced to 9 months hard labor, suspended. But the fight did not pause. Back in Johannesburg, Mandela's legal work with Oliver Tambo and their black-run law firm, the first of its kind in the country, became another form of rebellion. Their tiny office, often too hot in summer and too cold in winter, was always full. Mothers seeking justice for beaten sons, miners denied wages, fathers detained without reason. Many couldn't afford to pay, but Mandela never turned them away. In those dusty files, he found thousands of stories that matched his own. Stories of dignity denied, families shattered, dreams starved. Each one fueled his rage. Each one made him more dangerous to the state. The government noticed. They began surveilling him, tracking his steps, tapping his phones. photographing him at night. They banned him from public gatherings, silenced his speeches, and restricted his movement. Mandela was now labeled a dangerous agitator. But every attack made him stronger. He studied revolutionaries around the world, Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, and quietly began to ask, what if peaceful resistance wasn't enough? What if evil couldn't be reasoned with? What if it had to be fought? Then came the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. That day, 69 unarmed protesters were shot dead by police, most in the back as they fled. Blood pooled in the streets, and the image of lifeless black bodies lying face down on the pavement shocked the world. Mandela was devastated, furious, grieving, and transformed. This massacre was the final nail in the coffin of passive resistance for him. He would later say, with a heavy heart, that the time had come to fight fire with fire. And so, in the shadows, he helped form Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC. Mandela was not eager for violence. But he believed that if the government met peaceful protests with bullets, then resistance must carry a spear. In secret, Mandela trained. He traveled across Africa, studying guerrilla tactics, meeting with freedom fighters, learning how oppressed peoples had risen. He visited Algeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, and even London. He wore disguises. He carried false documents. South Africa did not know where he was, but Mandela was becoming a soldier. He returned to lead underground attacks on government property, not to harm civilians, but to send a message. We will not kneel. Not anymore. He became known as the Black Pimpernel, evading capture again and again. But the government was closing in. And in 1962, they found him. He was arrested, charged with leaving the country illegally, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. But the worst was yet to come. While serving his sentence, police raided the ANC's secret hideout in Rivonia and found documents linking Mandela to sabotage operations. The regime had what it wanted, a reason to put him away for life. In the Rivonia trial, Mandela stood once more in the courtroom, not to beg for freedom, but to put apartheid on trial. And then he spoke the words that would echo through history. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. In 1964, at the end of the Rivonia trial, Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was 46 years old. The courtroom, full of journalists and family and fear, watched him disappear into the belly of the state, into a darkness designed to crush him. But no bars could silence the storm he had stirred. Robben Island, a place where the sea kept secrets and the stones carried stories of suffering. This windswept prison off the coast of Cape Town was home to South Africa's most feared political prisoners. And for the next 18 years, it would be Mandela's world. A world of blinding sunlight, backbreaking labor, and relentless isolation. His cell? Barely big enough for a man to lie down straight. No bed. No plumbing. Just a thin mat on the floor and a bucket. He rose each morning before dawn, worked all day in a lime quarry that burned the eyes and lungs, and returned to his cell each night covered in dust, silence, and the weight of memory. But Mandela did not break. He read. He wrote. He taught. He turned that prison into a school of revolution. Even the guards began to change. Some who arrived as cruel instruments of apartheid left years later with softened hearts, shaped by Mandela's patience, his dignity, his unshakable kindness. He never shouted. He never begged. Even in prison, he led. Yet behind the stone walls, Mandela was also a husband and a father, roles that apartheid tried to erase. His wife Winnie, herself hunted and harassed, was allowed only rare visits. His children grew up without him. Letters took months to arrive. News from the outside world was filtered and censored. He missed funerals, birthdays, first steps, first words, each absence a silent wound. But the world had not forgotten him. Outside, the struggle burned brighter. The youth of Soweto took to the streets in 1976, chanting freedom songs with fire in their eyes. International sanctions, artists, activists, and even world leaders began to speak one name louder and louder. Free Nelson Mandela. And then something remarkable began to happen. Mandela, once a man erased from newspapers and textbooks, became a symbol, a myth, a movement. People wore his face on shirts, painted his name on walls, sang his struggle in churches and concerts and protests from London to Lagos. He had become more than a prisoner. He was now a prophet in chains. In the 1980s, after over 2 decades in prison, Mandela was quietly moved to Pollsmoor Prison and later Victor Verster Prison, where he was given slightly better conditions and allowed to walk in gardens and receive more visitors. The government thought comfort might tame him. It did not. The world's pressure mounted. The apartheid regime was cornered, economically strangled, politically isolated, and morally bankrupt. Internally, protests were constant. Externally, nations demanded change. In secret meetings with government officials, Mandela held firm. He told them, "You want me to denounce violence while you hold the whip? I will not negotiate with a gun to my people's head." He insisted on one truth. There would be no peace without justice. Then, on February 11th, 1990, after 27 years, 6 months, and 6 days, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster Prison. Tall, calm, unshaken. The world watched. Millions wept. He held Winnie's hand as he raised his fist to the sky, a gesture not of vengeance, but of victory. In the silence that comes just before dawn, Nelson Mandela sat alone in a safe house, feeling the tightening noose of the apartheid regime drawing closer. He was no longer the energetic young man who once paced university corridors or the rising voice in ANC meetings. He was now a marked man. His name echoed through police radios, splashed across government wanted lists, and whispered in the homes of oppressed blacks and nervous whites alike. Mandela, the Black Pimpernel, had been underground for months, his every move cloaked in secrecy, his every meeting calculated, guarded, and brimming with risk. He moved from farmhouses to factories, from sympathetic white allies to loyal black comrades, all while the apartheid regime fanned its fire of fear. But Nelson was no longer afraid. Fear had long since left him. What remained was purpose. The sabotage campaign, initiated by the newly formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, was a turning point. Nelson had realized that peaceful protest had reached its bitter end. The state had responded to prayers with prison bars, to petitions with police dogs, and to peace marches with bullets. So Mandela became a soldier, not with bombs and bullets, but with strategy, ethics, and controlled rebellion. He ensured the movement never targeted human life. Only symbols of oppression. Power stations, communication lines, government buildings. Every act was calculated to disrupt, never to destroy the soul of the nation he dreamed of freeing. But dreams carry danger, and danger in apartheid South Africa was constantly watching. The night Mandela was arrested in 1962, disguised as a chauffeur in a borrowed Austin Westminster, was the night the fire moved to stone. The police, informed by the CIA, stopped the car near Howick. Mandela's identity was revealed. His underground journey was over. But it was only the beginning of his transformation. In Pretoria, he stood before a white judge. Calm, resolute, defiant. The charges: inciting workers to strike, leaving the country illegally, and more gravely to come, conspiracy to overthrow the government. He was sentenced to 5 years. But behind the courtroom doors, the government was preparing a larger trap. It would soon be called the Rivonia trial, one of the most famous trials in history. The courtroom was cold, not from temperature, but from tension, a suffocating chill that came from the knowledge that history was being weighed like dry paper in a white man's scale of justice. Nelson Mandela stood, not as a mere defendant, but as the face of a people's pain, the embodiment of a continent's struggle. The Rivonia trial, as it came to be known, was never meant to be fair. It was orchestrated to silence the voices of change, to crush the growing heartbeat of rebellion that echoed from the dusty townships to the polished floors of foreign embassies. But the apartheid regime had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated the power of a man who had already surrendered his life to an ideal. Mandela and his co-accused were charged with 221 acts of sabotage. The government labeled them terrorists, conspirators. They were painted not as freedom fighters, but as enemies of the state. Their weapons were pamphlets. Their grenades were ideas. Their mission, dismantling centuries of racial tyranny, was twisted into sedition. And still, Mandela never blinked. For months, the courtroom became a battleground, not of bullets, but of words. The prosecutors thundered with cold arrogance, and the state witnesses delivered their rehearsed lies with shaky conviction. But Mandela, he stood tall, voice even, eyes unwavering. His presence pierced through every hostile stare, every loaded question, every gavel slam meant to remind him of his place. Then came the final day, April 20th, 1964. Nelson Mandela rose from his chair not as a prisoner, but as a prophet of justice. What followed wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a manifesto for the soul of South Africa. The silence in the courtroom was no longer of oppression, but of reverence. Judges, guards, even journalists stopped breathing as he began. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. Each sentence was a thunderclap, every word a funeral bell for fear. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. The words didn't echo. They detonated. Across the courtroom, across the nation, across the world. Reporters scribbled in disbelief. Foreign embassies watched in silence. And the people of South Africa, those in hiding, those in chains, those in hope, felt a shift. The regime could no longer bury Mandela. They had given him a pulpit. But the cost was heavy. On June 12, 1964, the verdict came like a dull blade. Life imprisonment. No parole. No mercy. As the gavel fell, Mandela stood without flinching. Outside the courthouse, his supporters wept, not because they had lost, but because a part of them had been taken away. Yet, as Mandela was led away in handcuffs, his back remained straight, his face calm. He did not look like a man defeated. He looked like a man rising. The road to Robben Island began not with a prison truck, but with that moment, that speech, that sacrifice. Mandela was no longer a man. They had made him a legend. And as the steel gates of his future clanged shut behind him, the world began to listen. Because freedom had a name now, and it would not be forgotten. The sea was vast and cruel as the boat cut across the gray waters. No one spoke. The guards were stern, silent. The prisoners, chained, staring, knew where they were headed. But Mandela, standing among them, wasn't afraid. Behind him was a courtroom. Ahead was Robben Island. And inside him was a country. The island emerged like a wound on the ocean. Cold, barren, brutal. This was no prison. It was a calculated graveyard for spirits. Designed not to hold bodies, but to crush souls. Mandela was placed in cell number 5, a 6-foot by 9-foot concrete cage with no bed, no plumbing, no comfort. A bucket in the corner, a mat on the floor, and the wind howling like a ghost through the cracks in the bars. Days turned to months, months to years. The routine was inhumane. Hard labor in the limestone quarry under a sun that showed no mercy. Eyes burned from the blinding white stone. Backs ached. Hands blistered. And yet, in that pain, Mandela built something indestructible. Not with bricks, but with silence. With dignity. The guards called him boy. They denied him long pants. They restricted his letters. They tore apart his family's words before he could read them. News from the outside came months late, if it came at all. And yet, Mandela endured. He read. He wrote. He waited. Robben Island became a paradox, a place of punishment that bred purpose. Mandela started teaching his fellow inmates law, politics, history. The quarry became a classroom. The cells became seminars. He called it the University of Robben Island. Here, warriors were molded, leaders trained, futures drafted. Still, time moved slowly. He missed the funerals of his mother and son. He wasn't allowed to mourn them properly. Grief sat with him in silence. Sometimes it screamed, but it never shattered him. His visitors were rare. Even his wife, Winnie, often had to fight the system just to see him for 30 minutes behind glass. And yet, when she arrived, when their eyes met, when hands pressed on opposite sides of that window, it was enough. Love, though strangled, survived. Years passed. A decade. Then another. His face aged. His body thinned. But his mind, his will, only grew stronger. By the late 1970s, whispers began to circulate through the concrete. Guards changed. Policies shifted. The world beyond the waves had started remembering the man on the island. Protests surged. Songs were sung in his name. Free Mandela echoed across continents. Inside, he was offered conditional release. He refused. Only free men can negotiate, he said. Prisoners cannot enter into contracts. Mandela's dignity frightened the regime more than any gun ever could. By the 1980s, they moved him first to Pollsmoor Prison, then to Victor Verster. The cells grew larger. The restrictions eased. But the man had become larger still. No longer just a prisoner, he was a symbol. A moral giant behind iron bars. And then, after 27 years, 6 months, and 6 days on February 11th, 1990, the gates opened. Mandela walked out, not bowed, not bitter, but beaming. A nation watched in silence. The world held its breath. His fist rose into the sky, and with it generations stood taller. Because the man they tried to silence had become the voice of a new dawn. The sun burned soft that day in Cape Town, gentle, almost reverent, as the world watched a man step through the gates of Victor Verster Prison after nearly 3 decades. Nelson Mandela, now 71 years old, walked slowly, not because his spirit had weakened, but because the weight of a nation's hope rested on each step. The crowd surged. Tears blurred cameras. Flags waved. Fists rose. Voices trembled. Nelson Mandela is free. But freedom was complicated. South Africa was a powder keg of fear, fury, and unfinished history. The apartheid regime had legalized cruelty for nearly 50 years. Townships burned. Blood had soaked the soil of Soweto and Sharpeville. White South Africans feared revenge. Black South Africans demanded justice. The country teetered at the edge of civil war. And yet, Mandela chose a different road. Not vengeance, not retaliation, but reconciliation. He held press conferences not to condemn, but to calm. He spoke not in bitterness, but in balance. He said, "We must forget our terrible past and move forward together. We are one country. We are one people." It was radical. It was human. It was almost unbelievable. And it was the only way. In 1991, the African National Congress, ANC, long banned as a terrorist organization, was legalized. Mandela became its president. He began negotiating with the very people who had imprisoned him. With F.W. de Klerk, the last white president of apartheid South Africa, Mandela engaged in tense, dangerous talks. Assassinations continued. Massacres erupted. Right-wing groups plotted. But Mandela stood steady. His voice, calm but commanding, became a bridge over chaos. He met anger with dignity, hatred with humility. Then came April 27, 1994. South Africa held its first democratic elections. The lines stretched for miles, black, white, Indian, colored, standing together for the first time, voting as equals. For many, it was their first time voting at all. For the world, it was a miracle. Nelson Mandela won in a landslide. On May 10, 1994, he was sworn in as the first black president of South Africa. The inauguration was held at the Union Buildings in Pretoria, the very symbol of white power. Mandela stood there not to conquer, but to unite. Before a sea of citizens, presidents, and kings, he said, "Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another." And with that, the impossible became real. But Mandela's presidency was no fairy tale. The economy was in shambles. Crime was rampant. Inequality ran deep. Yet he worked tirelessly. He formed a government of national unity, including even former enemies. He launched the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Desmond Tutu, not to punish, but to heal. Victims shared their suffering. Perpetrators confessed. Forgiveness became justice. And when South Africa hosted the 1995 Rugby World Cup, Mandela walked onto the field wearing the jersey of the all-white Springbok team, a team once hated by black South Africans. He handed the trophy to the white captain, Francois Pienaar. In that moment, even the hardest hearts began to soften. Mandela led for 5 years. He didn't cling to power. He didn't chase legacy. In 1999, he stepped down, willingly, graciously, because true leaders know when to lead and when to let go. This chapter of his life, the journey from prisoner to president, was more than political. It was spiritual. It was the embodiment of a truth Mandela lived by. As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness behind, I'd still be in prison. He had freed not only himself, he had freed a nation from its past. When Nelson Mandela stepped down from the presidency in 1999, the world held its breath, not out of fear, but out of awe. For in a continent where leaders often clung to power, Mandela walked away willingly, wrapped not in riches or medals, but in moral authority. He had entered office with chains still fresh on his skin. He left it with dignity carved into every crease of his face. But his mission was far from over. He became a global elder, a guiding force for peace and justice across the world. While other leaders governed with armies, Mandela ruled with words, empathy, and an unwavering belief in human goodness. He launched the Nelson Mandela Foundation, fighting HIV/AIDS, poverty, and inequality. He spoke out boldly against the Iraq War, against corrupt regimes, and even gently criticized his successors in South Africa. Yet behind the global stage was a man who craved peace of another kind. He moved to Kunu, the village of his childhood, where hills rolled like memories and the wind whispered in Kosa. He spent time with his grandchildren. He laughed again. He aged. And still, the world kept calling. Presidents sought his wisdom. Celebrities wanted his presence. He became a symbol of resilience, of forgiveness, of possibility. But age, even for giants, is relentless. His health declined. Hospital visits became frequent. Each time, South Africans lit candles outside his home. The streets fell into prayer. The world watched. And then came December 5th, 2013. Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95. The earth paused. From Soweto to Shanghai, from Harlem to Helsinki, the world mourned, not just a man, but a mirror of our better selves. In South Africa, people danced and wept at once, chanting songs of struggle and freedom. Because in their grief, they still felt his presence. At his memorial, over 90 heads of state gathered. Barack Obama called him a giant of history. The stadium shook with applause and tears. But Mandela's legacy wasn't buried with him. It lives in courtrooms where justice rises. It breathes in classrooms where black children and white children learn together. It echoes in prisons where forgotten souls find redemption. And it whispers in the words he left behind. Death is something inevitable. When a man has done what he considers to be his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. Nelson Mandela was more than a freedom fighter, more than a president, more than a legend. He was a soul unshaken by cruelty, a heart unbroken by prison, a leader uncorrupted by power. He showed us that forgiveness is not weakness. It is the greatest strength, that peace is not passive. It is a choice made again and again, even in the face of violence. He walked from the shadows of a prison cell to the highest office of a fractured land, and still had the grace to smile at those who once called him enemy. He was not perfect, but he was human, and he was brave. And sometimes, that's exactly what the world needs most. This was the story of Nelson Mandela, the boy who dreamed beyond the hills of Kunu, the rebel who shook an empire, and the father who taught a broken nation how to heal.